They said no man chose solitude unless something had been taken from him. For Elias Walker, that something had a name, Annabelle. Most folks called him Eli. He never corrected them. Sounded less like a grieving husband, more like a man trying to carry on. Once this land had heard her laughter. Once these walls had echoed with lullabies and firelight prayers. But that was before the fever came, before the prairie winds howled through an empty cradle. Now Eli rose with the sun, not out of purpose, but habit. The ranch stood cold, not for lack of fire, but for lack of voices. He spoke to the horses more than he spoke to men, and even they had learned not to wait for softness in his tone. Ironwood Ranch hadn't seen visitors in years. The trail up from Rustwater Creek was long and bitter, and Eli made sure folks knew he preferred it that way. But fate doesn't knock, it arrives in silence. And on a frost-bitten morning, as Eli turned the corner of his barn with hay in his arms and sorrow in his chest, he saw them, 3 children, a girl, a boy, and a baby wrapped in rags, huddled like ghosts beside his cattle. No words, just eyes that pleaded for warmth. That's when everything began to change. The wind had teeth that morning, sharp, unrelenting. Elias Walker pulled his duster tighter around him, the collar stiff with frost. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the yard between the barn and the house, arms full of hay, breath fogging in short bursts. The sun was just a smear behind the clouds, offering no heat, only light. Ironwood Ranch stretched quiet and hard beneath the sky, every board and beam speaking of a man who kept things standing because he didn't know what else to do. He was halfway to the barn when he heard it, a cough, wet and small. He froze. The horses had already stirred in their stalls when he approached, but this wasn't them. This was human. Elias slowly lowered the hay and reached for the sidearm he rarely needed, but always wore. Silence returned, heavy and waiting. Then came the soft shuffle of feet on frozen straw, followed by a voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't shoot." He rounded the stall and found them. A girl, maybe 10, standing in front of a boy who looked younger by 2 or 3 years. In her arms, a bundled form, a baby swaddled in what looked like an old saddle blanket, its breath puffing like steam from a kettle. They were filthy, shivering, and so out of place it took him a moment to believe they were real. "We ain't here to steal," the girl said, chin lifted, though her voice shook. "Just needed a place out of the wind." Elias didn't answer. He studied them with the same stillness he'd offer a wild horse. Quiet, careful, assessing for wounds you couldn't see. The boy coughed again. It sounded worse up close. The girl's coat was more patches than fabric, boots too big and lined with what looked like newspaper. Her cheeks were raw, her lips cracked. The baby in her arms stirred and let out a sound so small it nearly broke him. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, voice low and rusted from disuse. "Since last night," she said. "We walked a long way." Elias took a breath. The barn was cold, not cold enough to kill, but close. He looked out at the yard, the drifted snow, the single trail of boot prints leading to the barn doors. "Names," he said. "I'm Clara. That's my brother Caleb. The baby's Mari." "Where's your folks?" Clara's jaw clenched. "Gone. Gone." That word could mean 1,000 things out here. Dead, drunk, jailed, run off. He didn't ask again. The baby whimpered, a soft, keening sound. Elias stepped back. "Come on." Clara hesitated. "You'll freeze out here," he said simply. She nodded once and nudged Caleb forward. The boy didn't look up, just followed his sister, clutching the edge of her coat. They stepped into the house like creatures unused to firelight. Elias stirred the coals in the hearth until they flared, throwing shadows up the walls. He brought out a cast iron kettle and set it to boil, then pulled the quilt off his bed and laid it near the fire. "Sit." Clara eased down first, tucking the baby into her lap. Caleb collapsed beside her, shoulders hunched and eyes darting around the room. Elias moved without comment. Bread from the pantry, water from the pump, an old can of beans he warmed over the flame. Clara watched everything, eyes sharp beneath the grime. "What happened?" he asked after a while. Clara stared into the fire. "We were in a wagon with some folks after our mama died. Man said he'd take us to family in the Dakotas. Paid him what little we had." Elias said nothing. He left us near the creek crossing. Said he'd come back. Never did. How long ago? 4 days. The baby let out a sharp cry. Clara rocked her gently. Elias reached for a clean rag, dipped it in warm water, and offered it. Clara took it without a word and wiped Mari's face. Her hands trembled. She's sick? He asked. She's been burning up off and on. I don't know what to do. He crouched beside them, pressed a weathered hand to the child's brow. Too hot. I've got some willow bark, he muttered more to himself than her. Ain't much, but it's better than nothing. She nodded, blinking fast. You should have gone to the town, he said. Clara looked at him then. Really looked. They'd split us up. That stopped him cold. He knew she was right. Townsfolk meant well, but the law didn't have room for sentiment. A girl her age? They'd find a farm to take her. Caleb, maybe an orphanage in Helena. The baby, Lord knew, nothing good. You walked here, he said. How'd you know about this place? Clara hesitated. Our mama knew someone named Annabelle. Said if we ever got stuck, this ranch was safe. Elias sat back like he'd been struck. Annabelle, his wife. His gaze dropped to the ring around his neck. Sarah's ring still warm beneath the flannel. She was my wife, he said quietly. Clara nodded. Mama said she was kind. Elias stood and walked to the window. The land outside was still white, still brutal, but something in the house had changed. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was waiting. I've got a few extra shirts, he said after a while. Blankets too. Clara didn't answer, but her posture softened, just a little. That night after the children had eaten and fallen asleep, curled like pups near the hearth, Elias sat in his old chair. The rifle still leaned in the corner, but for once he didn't feel the need to reach for it. Instead, he watched the firelight flicker on 3 sleeping faces. Strangers, but not. Maybe it was Annabelle. Maybe it was Providence. Or maybe it was just time. Time to let something new grow in the ashes. By morning, the storm had buried most of the fence line. Eli Walker stood on the porch with his coat flapping in the wind, coffee cooling fast in the tin mug he held. He watched the snowbanks drift like white waves across the pasture. No cattle in sight. They knew better than to fight weather like this. Inside, the house was unrecognizable, not in shape, but in spirit. Soft footsteps upstairs told him Sophie was awake first. She moved quiet, the way girls who'd grown up too fast often did, like someone always bracing for something to go wrong. She came down wrapped in a borrowed flannel, her hair still damp from the night before. Morning, Eli said, not turning. Slept at all? Some, she answered. Her voice had that hushed, wary tone again. Mari didn't cry much. Gabriel was warm. Thank you for the room. Eli just nodded. He didn't know how to accept gratitude anymore. Not really, not after losing Annabelle. You didn't thank someone for leaving the porch light on. It was just what you did. Sophie stepped beside him, staring out at the white land like she was trying to memorize it. Is this still Montana? She asked. It feels like we landed on the moon. That's winter for you, Eli muttered. Makes everything feel farther away. A thump sounded from upstairs. Gabriel jumping down the last stair, socks sliding on the old wood floor. He darted into the room, flush-cheeked and barefoot, then froze when he saw Eli. Morning, son, Eli said. Gabriel blinked, then looked at his sister, silently asking what came next. Sophie gave him a small nod. Morning, sir, the boy said, voice raspy from the lingering cough. Eli pointed to the fire. Still some heat in there. You hungry? The boy nodded. His stomach spoke louder than he did. Eli walked toward the kitchen and began pulling what he could from the shelves. A few eggs, cornmeal, some lard. Not much, but it would stretch. Sophie moved beside him without being asked. She cracked eggs one-handed, knew how to stir without spilling, didn't flinch at the heat of the skillet. Annabelle would have said, that one's had to raise herself and then some. Mari woke just before breakfast finished. Her cries were soft but insistent. Eli looked up from flipping cornbread in the pan to see Sophie already scooping her into her arms, murmuring quiet Spanish that reminded him of days long past, of Lucia Navarro and the lilting voice she used to calm the world. He found himself watching the baby a little too long. She's better today, Sophie said, noticing. Still warm, but not burning. We'll keep a close eye, Eli said. They ate in silence, save for Mary's soft gurgles and Gabriel's occasional sniffle. The boy kept stealing glances at the bookshelf, like he wanted to ask something but didn't dare. "You read?" Eli asked, surprising himself. Gabriel nodded slowly. "A little. Mama taught me." "Lucia, right?" Sophie nodded. "Lucia Navarro. She worked at the diner in Silver Hollow for a while. She knew your wife, I think." Eli's hand paused mid-bite. "Annabelle." The name came out thick. He cleared his throat and took a sip of water. "Yeah, they were close once. Before time did what it does." There was a long pause. "Mama used to say this was the safest place she ever knew," Sophie said softly. "Said if things ever got bad enough, we should come here." We remembered. "You walked far?" "Most of a day. Then the storm hit. We cut through the woods. I knew about the barn because she told me. Said you wouldn't shoot first and ask later." Eli snorted. "Depends on the day." But his voice didn't carry its usual bite. It was hard to be angry with three children who trudged through winter on the memory of a promise. Mari fell asleep again in Sophie's arms, and Gabriel sat quietly thumbing through a worn book of ranch illustrations. Cattle brands, saddle types, horses mid-gallop. Eli watched them like a man waking up in someone else's dream. The wind howled outside. Fence work was impossible. So was town. That left only inside things. "You two," Eli said, standing and grabbing a folded quilt. "Come with me." They followed him up the narrow stairs to the room across from the guest bedroom. Annabelle's sewing room. He hadn't opened it in months. Dust motes danced in the pale light from the window. Fabric bolts leaned in the corners. A cradle sat under the window, untouched since. Eli didn't explain it. He just set the quilt on the floor and started pulling open drawers. Blankets, thread, scissors. Might be something here worth salvaging. Sophie stepped in slowly, like entering a church. She reached for the rocking chair and ran her fingers along the worn arms. "This was hers?" Eli nodded. "Everything in here was." They spent the rest of the morning sorting through it. Sophie folded cloth into neat squares. Gabriel carried spools like sacred cargo. Mari dozed in a laundry basket lined with wool. By noon, the room smelled of cedar and memory. "She must have been kind," Sophie said once. "Mama talked about her like she was." "She was the best part of this place," Eli said. "Still is, in a way." The word surprised him. It had been years since he said Annabelle's name without it hollowing out his chest. But here, with these children and the wind pressing against the windows, it didn't feel like pain. Not entirely. That afternoon, Gabriel helped Eli check the woodpile while Sophie reheated stew for supper. They didn't talk much, but the boy's eyes followed everything. How to split logs, stack them tight, check for rot. Eli saw himself in that quiet study. He'd been the same at 8. Only difference was, Gabriel had someone watching over him. By the time night fell again, the storm had calmed. The fire snapped in the hearth. The kids curled under patchwork quilts that still smelled faintly of lilac and smoke. Eli stood by the doorway of the guest room, watching as Sophie tucked Mari in, singing low. When she turned, he asked, "You got a plan for after the thaw?" Sophie's eyes dropped. "Stay together. That's all I know." He nodded. "That's a plan worth keeping." She hesitated. You're not going to call the sheriff, are you?" Eli thought of Clara Ramsey still patrolling Silver Hollow with that badge she wore like a second skin. She was fair. But the system? The system didn't always care about fair. "Not tonight," he said. Sophie exhaled, a sound full of more than breath. "Thank you." Eli glanced down the hall. "You can lock your door if it helps you sleep." She nodded once, then softly closed it behind her. Eli Walker stood in the hallway for a long moment, the silence of the house no longer empty but full. Something was changing. He could feel it in his bones. Outside, the moon spilled silver across the snow. And for the first time in 5 long winters, the wind didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like promise. The days passed like thawing ice, slow, deliberate, and always creaking underfoot. By the end of the week, the worst of the storm had passed. The wind had quieted to a mournful whisper, and the white world outside began to shift in color. Patches of brown earth peeked out near the south-facing fence, and icicles fell like glass from the eaves. Inside the cabin, something else was changing. Eli Walker sat at the kitchen table, running his thumb over the handle of an old pocket knife. Across from him, Gabriel was hunched over a worn sketch pad, brow furrowed, tongue peeking out as he tried to capture the shape of a mule deer from memory. Sophie had taken over the hearth. A kettle hissed softly above the flame, and in the corner baby Marie slept curled in a basket lined with Eli's old wool coat. The room smelled like cinnamon and pine smoke. "You got a good eye," Eli said, glancing at the boy's sketch. Gabriel looked up. "I'm trying to get the legs right. They bend funny." "They do," Eli agreed. "Takes a while to learn how to see what's really there, not what you think should be." Sophie looked over from the kettle. "Mama used to say the same thing about people." Eli nodded, lips twitching into the ghost of a smile. Lucia was right more often than not. The name settled gently in the room. It was the first time anyone had said it aloud since the storm broke. They ate supper early that night. Cornbread, pinto beans, and a bit of smoked pork Eli had saved for lean weeks. Conversation was light. Sophie told a story about her mother's tomato garden, and Gabriel asked if horses ever got jealous of each other. Eli didn't know, but he promised to watch for signs. Later, when the kids had gone upstairs and the cabin dimmed to embers and oil light, Eli stepped out onto the porch. The cold bit less than it had the week before, but the air still carried winter's edge. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he lit a match and brought it to the end of his pipe. He stared toward the tree line, toward the long trail that wound down to Silver Hollow. That's when he saw it. Smoke. Thin, distant, but steady. Not the curling smoke of a chimney, but something sharper. Wilder. He took 2 steps forward, squinting through the dark. The fire wasn't on his land, but close enough to raise his hackles. His first thought was lightning. Maybe a hunter's fire that got away. But something in his gut, a rancher's instinct, twisted tight. He put out the pipe, stepped back inside, and checked the rifle over the mantel. Upstairs, the sound of quiet breathing told him the children were asleep. He didn't wake them, not yet. By morning, the smoke was gone, but the unease remained. At breakfast, Sophie noticed. "You're quiet," she said. "Always been," Eli answered. But the edge in his tone made her look twice. He saw it, the tension in her shoulders, the way her spoon slowed in the bowl. Gabriel didn't seem to notice. He was busy teaching Mari to bang a wooden spoon on the table without dropping it. Later that afternoon, Clara Ramsey rode in. Her badge caught the sun just before her horse crested the hill. Eli met her at the fence line, his coat half-buttoned, rifle slung behind the door. "Didn't expect to see you this far out," he said. Clara tipped her hat, eyes shadowed. "Didn't expect to be out this far either, but I figured you might have seen something." "Smoke last night, ridge west of here. Thought it might have been windblown embers." "Wasn't," Clara said, reins tightening in her gloved hands. "Old delivery wagon was found burned near Ravens Fork Road. Nobody inside, but tracks in the snow said at least 2 people left it on foot, one of them limping." Eli felt the shift in his gut like a fence post giving in deep soil. "You think they're headed this way?" "I think they might already be close. Thought I should warn you. Appreciate it?" Clara didn't ask questions, not the kind that pressed. She'd known Eli too long, known Annabelle too. But as she turned to ride, she looked back once. "You've got young ones in the house now, don't you?" Eli didn't answer. "You're not the only one keeping secrets, Eli, but you might be the only one who can protect what's left." Then she was gone, hooves vanishing into white silence. That night, Sophie stayed up late, shelling beans by lantern light. Gabriel read to Mari from a battered copy of Ranch Tales for Boys. The baby cooed at the sound of his voice, even when he stumbled through the longer words. Eli watched them from the threshold, jaw tight. He couldn't protect them from the past. He didn't even know what they were running from. Not yet. But he could keep the fire lit. He could keep the door locked. And he could load the rifle beside his bed, same as he had every night since Annabelle died. Only now it wasn't for himself. It was for them. And somewhere out there in the thawing dark, someone was moving, maybe coming closer, maybe watching already. The knock didn't come until the 3rd night after Clara's visit. Eli had just set another log on the fire, the warmth of pine wood crackling through the cabin's silence. Sophie and Gabriel were upstairs, He could hear them whispering through the floorboards, telling stories the way children do when they're too tired to sleep but too afraid not to talk. Mari lay swaddled in a quilt near the hearth, her little hands twitching in dreams. The quiet in the room felt like glass, fragile, still. Then the knock shattered it. Not a loud one, just three deliberate raps. Eli froze. He didn't reach for the door. He didn't call out. Instead, he turned slowly, took his rifle from its post by the mantel, and stepped to the side of the frame where the firelight wouldn't cast his shadow on the curtain. He waited. No second knock came. He stepped forward and eased the door open 2 inches. A man stood there, or what was left of one, coat torn, one hand wrapped in a filthy rag. A wide-brimmed hat sat low over his face, and his stance, off balance and leaning slightly, told Eli he was either drunk, wounded, or both. "You Eli Walker?" the man asked, voice like dry leaves rustling through gravel. "Depends who's asking." The man chuckled, low and humorless. "Name's Harlan Briggs. I ride for someone. He's looking for 3 runaways." Eli's grip on the rifle tightened. "You lost something, Mr. Briggs?" Briggs took a step forward and Eli stepped out fully, blocking the door behind him. "Girl, 11, answers to Sophie. Boys maybe 8, baby in arms. Came up this way through the pass, snow-covered, left a busted wagon outside of town. You wouldn't happen to have seen any little ghosts on your land, would you?" Eli didn't blink. "See cattle, see wind. Haven't seen much else." Briggs smiled with his teeth, and it wasn't kind. "My employer's generous, Mr. Walker. Generous to those who cooperate." Eli's eyes narrowed. "And to those who don't? He's less generous." A long moment passed between them, one man standing for something he couldn't explain, the other threatening something he hadn't yet earned the right to name. Then Eli said, low and flat, "You tell your employer if he wants to take what ain't his, he better ride up here himself." Briggs spat into the snow, turned without another word, and limped back to where a shadow of a horse waited on the ridge. Eli didn't lower the rifle until the rider was gone. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he nailed boards across the kitchen window, checked the door locks twice, and lit 2 lanterns in the hallway. Just past midnight, Sophie came downstairs, blanket draped around her shoulders. "You saw someone." Eli didn't bother to lie. "Man came asking questions. About us. About you," he corrected. "Said someone's looking to collect what he thinks he owns." Sophie said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the blanket's edge. After a pause, she asked, "Did Mama know he was coming?" Eli looked at her, then, not like a child, but like someone he might someday trust with a hard truth. "I reckon your mama always knew trouble has a long memory." Sophie stepped to the fire, crouched beside Mary's basket, and tucked the quilt higher under the baby's chin. "He's not her father," she said suddenly. Eli turned. "I don't know if she ever said it out loud. Maybe she didn't want to admit it. But I knew. The way he looked at us. The way she flinched. Was he ever good to her?" Sophie's jaw tensed. "He was good at pretending. That's not the same." Eli crouched beside her. "And your mama? Lucia?" Sophie's eyes softened. "She tried. She did everything she could to protect us. But the world got heavy. Too heavy to carry alone." Eli nodded once. "Ain't meant to be carried alone." Sophie looked up at him, the firelight flickering in her eyes. "I don't want to run again, Mr. Walker." "Neither do I." Upstairs, Gabriel stirred, mumbling something in his sleep. Marie, warm and safe between them, gave a soft grunt and kicked free of the blanket. Eli reached out and gently pulled it back up, smoothing it over her chest. Her tiny hand caught his thumb and didn't let go. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it was different now. Not a storm, just the kind of wind that comes before something important, a reckoning maybe, or a choice. Eli stood and said, "We best be ready. If they're coming, they'll come soon. You ever used a rifle?" Sophie shook her head. He studied her for a second. "Tomorrow after chores, we'll fix that." Sophie didn't smile, but her shoulders lifted just a bit, as if she'd decided she would not be carried, not anymore. And Eli understood. Sometimes a man didn't build a family. Sometimes it found him on the wind, holding on with tiny hands and fierce eyes. And if that was true, if this was his to protect, then come hell or high snow, he'd do it. Snow came in heavy the next morning, thick and silent, like the world was holding its breath. Eli woke to the sound of Sophie chopping wood out back, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing across the ridge. She shouldn't have been doing it. He'd told her not to. But there she was, his flannel shirt hanging down to her knees, jaw clenched, swinging with everything she had. Eli stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching on the new snow. "You think that stack's gonna split itself twice just to spite me?" Sophie paused mid-swing. "Thought I'd get ahead of it." "You're 11, he said, voice rough from sleep. "You don't need to get ahead of anything but fractions and warm socks." She set the axe down slowly. "I didn't sleep much." Eli walked down the steps, picked up a log and began stacking it on the porch. "Neither did I." They worked in silence for a while, side by side, until Gabriel came to the door, rubbing his eyes. "I heard a horse," he said softly. Eli turned fast. Gabriel pointed toward the trail. Sure enough, fresh tracks curved around the tree line. Hoof prints, one set, not recent, but not snowed over either. Someone had come close. Close enough to see the cabin, maybe even watched it. Eli stepped down into the yard, following the trail until it vanished near the ridge. Whoever it was hadn't come to talk, just to look, to wait. That was worse. By the time he returned to the cabin, his breath was white steam in the cold air, and his decision had hardened like iron in snow. He turned to Sophie. "We ride at first light tomorrow." She blinked. "Ride where?" "Ravens Bluff, sheriff's office. Clara Ramsey still got friends in town. If Harlan Briggs is sniffing around on someone else's orders, I want it on record. What if we don't come back?" He looked her dead in the eyes. "Then we take what matters with us." That night he packed. Extra blankets, cartridges, dried meat, Marie's few things. He wrapped Lucia Navarro's old photo in oilcloth and tucked it deep in his saddlebag. Upstairs, Gabriel helped Sophie roll up their mother's shawl. "She never would have wanted us to hide forever," he whispered. Sophie didn't answer. She was busy checking the little cloth pouch where she kept the silver cross Lucia had worn. She held it like it might burn her hand. Later, they ate a quiet supper, root stew and cornbread, the last of the good batch, and Eli sat by the fire with Mari on his knee. She was warm and heavy and halfway asleep, one chubby hand wrapped tight around his thumb. "You think we're doing the right thing?" Sophie asked from the rocking chair, voice barely above a whisper. Eli didn't answer right away. "I think there ain't such a thing as right and wrong when you're protecting a child. There's just what you can live with." "And what can you live with?" Eli looked into the fire. "Not losing her, not losing either of you." Sophie leaned forward. "If something happens, if that man comes while we're gone, he won't. But if he does," Eli's jaw tightened, "then Clara will have his name, and the law will know who to follow." Sophie nodded, her eyes shadowed. She didn't believe in the law. Not really. Not after what she'd seen. But she believed in Eli now. That was enough. Before dawn, they saddled the horses. Gabriel kissed Mari's forehead twice and whispered something no one heard. Eli lifted the baby into Sophie's arms, wrapped in a wool blanket, then handed Gabriel the reins to the pack mule. "You stay close to your sister," he said, "no matter what." "I will." "Good man." Then he turned to Sophie. "You ride ahead. I'll watch the rear." She hesitated. "What if they're already on the trail?" "Then we lead them straight into Clara Ramsey's front yard." She gave a single nod and swung up into the saddle. The ride was slow at first. Too much snow, not enough light. But as the sun rose, the trail grew clearer. They passed the frozen creek, the bend in the road where Lucia's wagon had once broken down, the charred stump where Eli had cut wood the day after the children arrived. Every piece of land held a memory now. Halfway to Ravens Bluff, they heard it. A crack. Not thunder, not ice. A rifle. Sophie pulled up hard, heart hammering. Mari stirred in her arms but didn't cry. Eli scanned the ridge. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Then a voice, rough and familiar, drifted through the trees. "Give me the girl, Walker." Harlan Briggs. Eli pulled his rifle and wheeled his horse to face the tree line. Sophie slid down, clutching Mari, and tucked herself behind a fallen log. "Stay down," Eli barked. Then everything went still again. A single silhouette emerged from the trees. Briggs, one hand raised, the other resting on his holster. "You know who I ride for," he called out. "You can't keep her. Ain't your fight." Eli stepped forward, rifle at the ready. "It is now." Briggs spat into the snow. "You think you can outrun Clay Maddox? He don't stop. He don't forget. He don't forgive." "Neither do I," Eli growled. Briggs hesitated. Then without a word, he turned and vanished back into the trees. Eli stood there a long time, rifle aimed at nothing but silence. Then he turned back to the children. Sophie was still crouched, shielding Mari with her own body. Gabriel hadn't moved from her side. "You all right?" Eli asked. Sophie nodded. "Are we going to keep going?" Eli looked at the trail ahead, then at the ridge behind them. "Number, we go back. But we don't lead him to Clara. Not yet. Not until I know we can finish what we start." Sophie swallowed. "What do we do?" Eli looked down at the snow, at the path already marked behind them. He could feel the storm gathering again, not in the sky, but in the ground, in his blood. He turned to the children. "We go home. We get ready." By the time they reached the cabin, the wind had shifted, the kind that didn't howl but whispered warnings between the trees. Eli stepped off his horse, knees stiff, eyes on the horizon. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. Inside, the fire had burned low. Gabriel hurried to stack wood, Sophie checked Mari's blankets, and Eli loaded every shell he had left into the old Winchester. He nailed planks across the windows, pushed the bureau against the front door, poured a line of ash across the threshold the way Annabelle used to when she was nervous. "I saw him," Sophie said quietly from the kitchen window. "Who?" "The man from the ridge. The one Harlan rides for." Eli froze. "How close?" "Not close enough to shoot, but close enough to see us." He said nothing. Just checked the back door one more time. That night, none of them slept. The storm broke around midnight. Not snow, not rain. Something quieter. A stillness that made the pine needles stand straight. Mari stirred in her sleep, whimpering. Gabriel held her close. Eli sat by the fire with the rifle across his knees. He waited. At first light, they came. 5 riders, moving slow like they didn't expect trouble. But Eli knew trouble wore patience like a disguise. He stepped onto the porch, shotgun slung, rifle in hand. Sophie stood behind him, holding Mari in one arm, a pistol in the other. Gabriel was at the window watching. The lead horse broke ahead. Its rider wore a coat the color of ash and a hat pulled low. Eli knew who it was before he even dismounted. Clay Maddox. "Mr. Walker," he called out. His voice was low and smooth, like a snake warming on stone. "You've got something that belongs to me." Eli stepped forward. "She left your name behind with the bruises you gave her." Maddox smiled. It didn't touch his eyes. "I'm here for what's mine. The child. The blood, she's not yours, not in the way that matters." Behind him, Sophie shifted. Mari let out a single sharp cry. Maddox's smile vanished. "You got no right," he growled. Eli leveled the rifle. "I got every right a man has when he chooses to stand." Maddox's men moved, but not fast, testing him. Eli didn't flinch. "I buried a wife," he said. "I held a son I couldn't raise alone, but I never backed down from what was mine to protect. That baby, that girl, that boy in there, they came to me with nothing but fear and frost on their lips. And you think I'll hand them over because you bark loud?" Maddox dismounted. He drew. Eli fired first. The shot slammed into Maddox's shoulder, spinning him to the snow. The rest of the men scattered, returning fire. Splinters flew. The porch rail shattered. Sophie fired once, one clean shot that dropped a rider trying to flank them. Gabriel, trembling, passed shells to Eli as fast as he could load. Mari was screaming now, high and desperate. "Hold on!" Eli shouted. The standoff lasted minutes but felt like years. Then, just as fast as it began, it ended. The last of Maddox's men turned tail. Maddox, bleeding in the snow, tried to crawl toward his horse. Eli stepped down the steps. "You leave this mountain," he said, standing over the man. "You never come back." Maddox coughed, blood on his lips. "This ain't over." "It is for you." Eli didn't fire again. He didn't have to. He turned and walked back to the cabin, rifle loose in his hands, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Inside, Sophie was rocking Mari on the floor. Gabriel stood frozen in the corner, tears streaking his cheeks. "We're okay," Eli said. "We're safe." It wasn't entirely true. Not yet, but it would be. 2 days later, Sheriff Clara Ramsey rode up the trail with a pair of deputies and found the evidence of what had happened. She listened without interrupting as Eli explained, voice steady, hands firm. "I didn't ask for this," he said, "but I'll see it through." Clara nodded. "You did what was right. Sometimes the law comes second to that." She looked at Sophie, at Gabriel, at baby Marie asleep in her arms. "You want to make it official?" she asked. "The guardianship?" Eli glanced at the children, then back at Clara. "No," he said, "not official, just real." Spring arrived slowly in the mountains. It always did. Annabelle's daffodils pushed through the frost like they'd never stopped blooming. The creek ran full again, and the birds came back. One morning, Gabriel followed Eli to the barn, helping him feed the cattle. "You think she'll remember any of this?" the boy asked, nodding toward Mari, now walking with a wobble and a grin. "She'll remember the warmth," Eli said. "The safety, the sound of her sister singing. Your voice when you tell her stories. That's enough." "And you?" Eli looked at the sunrise, the ridge beyond, the cabin still standing, despite everything. "I'll remember that you three gave me a second life." Later, Sophie found the courage to hang new curtains in Annabelle's room, and Eli let her. That night, he sat on the porch while Sophie read aloud by lamplight. Gabriel played with twine, making shapes, and Marie curled up with her quilt near the fire. The door stayed open. The air was still, and for the first time in years, Elijah Walker didn't feel alone. He felt like something had ended, and something else, something braver, quieter, but no less strong, had just begun. The snow may melt in spring, and the scars of winter may fade with time. But some stories stay with us. Like the way a stranger's kindness can change everything. Like the moment a man who thought he'd lost it all chooses to protect again. This time, not out of duty, but out of love. Elijah Walker didn't go looking for a family, but sometimes family finds you. If this story touched your heart, if you found a piece of yourself in Sophie's strength, Gabriel's quiet courage, or Eli's second chance, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let us know. Where are you watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the most? If you're new here, be sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got another tale waiting, one that might just meet you where you are, the way this one did. Until then, keep your fire burning, your door open, and your heart brave. We'll see you on the trail. The first time Clara heard about the man in the woods, it was around a fire too bright and a bottle too empty. "He don't speak," the old trader had said. "Don't come to town, don't leave tracks, might not even have a name anymore." The saloon laughed. Clara didn't. She just tucked the story away, like she did with all the others. That's what she did after all. She gathered stories, from barkeepers and blacksmiths, children and drunks. She shaped them into tales for quiet cabins, dusty porches, and the rare stranger who'd trade a coin for a good ending. But some stories felt different when you heard them. And this one, about a man who once burned down his own name just to live where no one could find it. This one tugged. So Clara saddled her mule, packed her notebook, and rode north. Not because she believed the tale, but because something in her did. And sometimes the only way to break a legend is to find the man at the center of it. The trees changed first, not in color or shape, but in sound. Back in the south, the forest buzzed. Crickets, birds, wind threading between leaves like music. But here, in the north woods, everything was muffled. Still, like the trees were listening, not singing. Clara reined in her mule near a slanted ridge and let the silence settle. No birds, no creaking branches, not even the echo of her own breath. Just quiet, old quiet, the kind that came before language. She clicked her tongue and nudged the mule forward. The trail was little more than memory, half-worn tracks through pine needles and patches of rock, overgrown and reluctant to lead anywhere at all. If not for the trader's directions, and a folded scrap of charcoal sketch she'd traded for in a mining town, she might have turned back. But the story was already inside her now, and stories didn't like being left unfinished. Clara had been traveling for 6 days, one bedroll, one water skin, a pouch of dried apples and biscuits that crumbled if you looked at them too hard, and her notebook. Always her notebook. It was tucked in her satchel, bound in leather and soot, pages filled with stories not her own. She hadn't written her own story in years, not since her brother died, not since she realized that some memories were easier to carry when dressed up as fiction. But now she wondered what kind of tale she was writing herself into. A woman riding alone into a forest everyone else rode around. A name whispered like a warning. Reed. No last name. No age. Just Reed, like a sound you weren't supposed to say too loud. They say he burned his own house down, the old trader had told her. Said he was trying to kill the past. Didn't work. What did he do? She'd asked. But the man had only shaken his head. Don't matter what he did. He stayed. By late afternoon, the sky turned gray with the kind of clouds that like to watch before they cried. Clara tugged the brim of her hat lower and pressed forward. The mule named Ribbon didn't argue, but didn't hurry either. They moved like a story drifting toward its climax, reluctant but inevitable. And then she saw it, just past the bend in the pines. A clearing, wide and half wild. At its center, a cabin, not collapsed but clearly aged. Roof patched with bark, chimney crooked, smoke, thin and threadbare, rose like a question. And there, on the far side of a chopped wood stack, stood a man. He wasn't tall but broad, built like he'd been carved by something mean, beard thick, hair uncombed, eyes like frostbite. He didn't move, didn't call out, just watched her. Clara stopped at the edge of the clearing, lifted one hand, a greeting, a warning, a promise. He didn't raise his. She waited, 30 seconds, then dismounted. Ribbon snorted but stayed. Clara took 3 slow steps forward. The man turned and disappeared behind the cabin. No door slam, no shout. Just gone. She approached slowly, one boot in front of the other, like approaching a wounded animal, or a man who didn't know if he was one. The door was slightly open. She knocked anyway. No answer. She pushed it gently. It creaked like it had forgotten how to move. Inside, the air was warm and wood smoke heavy. Simple. A cot, a stove, a table with a cracked mug, and a knife half buried in wood shavings. The walls were lined with shelves of dried herbs, pelts, tin cans stacked in patterns that only made sense to someone who needed them to. And in the corner, he sat, on a stool, back to her, whittling something with a hand steady as silence. I'm not here to bother you, Clara said. No response. I'm Clara. Clara Ames Still Nothing. I tell stories, she added softer. The knife paused. Not for long. Just a breath. Then resumed. She stepped forward. Not close, just into the room. They say you don't talk. Nothing. They say you don't like people. Still nothing. They say a lot of things. But stories aren't truths. They're just better-dressed lies. That made him stop. He set the wood down, the knife, and turned. His eyes weren't empty. They were full. Too full. The kind of full that made people shut up forever. Clara met his gaze, didn't blink. If you want me gone, she said, say the word. He stared at her a long while, then spoke, voice rough and unused. One night. That's all he said. She nodded. One night. That evening, she set her things near the hearth, cooked a biscuit on the edge of the stove, didn't touch his side of the room. She didn't ask questions, didn't spin tales, just sat, quiet. And when he passed her a tin cup with warm water, she said thank you. He didn't reply, but he looked at her hands, at the ink stains on her fingers, and she thought she saw something move behind his eyes. A flicker, a memory. Maybe. Or maybe just the ghost of one. Outside, the wind picked up, and in the forest, something watched them both. The first story she told him was short, something about a fox who lived alone in a hollow log and stole bread from travelers, but left behind small stones in apology. It wasn't a remarkable tale, the kind children forget by morning, but she told it anyway, because the silence between them had started to grow teeth. He was sitting by the stove, running a whetstone over a hatchet blade. His movements were calm, rhythmic, like he was sharpening memory itself. Clara sat near the fire, boots off, one leg folded under the other, speaking softly into the flame like it was the only thing listening. When she finished, she didn't look at him. She just waited. Reed didn't speak, didn't nod, but the whetstone paused for half a second longer than it should have, and she smiled to herself. The next night she told him a different one, this time about a woman who couldn't speak, but whose shadow told stories wherever she went. No one believed the shadow until it started whispering names no one had said aloud in years. Halfway through, she caught Reed watching her reflection in the stovepipe. Not her, just the shape of her mouth. She didn't mention it, but her voice dipped lower, steadier, like she was telling it to the pipe itself. She told stories because it helped her exhale the parts of herself she couldn't name. Not just spoken ones. Everything became narrative to her. The way Reed cut wood at exactly the same hour each day, how he boiled water twice but only drank once, how he never left the cabin at night, but sometimes stood at the threshold like he was waiting for a ghost to come home. She took mental notes of all of it, not to unravel him, but to remember him. By the fourth evening, she had taken to writing short ideas in the margins of her notebook, phrases that might belong to him even if she didn't say them. The man is shaped like the tree he hides behind, heavy, rooted, but hollow too. His hands know what his voice forgot. Silence isn't absence, it's protection. She didn't share these with him, but once she caught him glancing at the open page when she stepped outside. He didn't say anything when she came back in, but the next morning he set a pencil beside her plate. Nothing more. Just that. The fifth story was personal. It wasn't meant to be, but it came out that way. She was tired, her voice worn from wind and distance, and when she lit the lamp and settled into her usual spot, the words came without thinking. There once was a girl who believed her brother had two hearts, she began. One for living, one for loving. She didn't look at Reed. He used to tell her stories while she braided rope or boiled potatoes or tried not to cry. He said he had to, because if he didn't talk, she might forget how to listen. She paused, the fire cracked. When he died, she kept hearing his voice anyway, in rivers and fences, in the sound boots make on wet ground. She looked up then. Reed was staring into the fire like it had betrayed him. She added gently, I think stories are just leftover love. Reed stood up, walked to the door and said, he had a good voice, then left. That was the first sentence he'd spoken in 4 days. She didn't follow, didn't smile, she just whispered, so do you. By now a pattern had formed. She told stories. He didn't ask her to, but he never left before she finished. Sometimes he sat, sometimes stood. Once he chopped wood outside in the dark, just close enough to hear, and each time she saw a different part of him twitch, shoulder, jaw, eyes, like her words were brushing against something old and buried. One day he cut himself while whittling, a clean slice down his thumb. Clara rose from her seat without asking, took his hand gently. He stiffened, didn't pull away. She wrapped it in cloth and said nothing about how warm his hand was, or how long it had been since he'd let anyone touch him. When she looked up, he was watching her, eyes dark, not afraid, just lost. You've done this before, he said. Clara nodded. Lots of wounds, she whispered, some deeper than others. The next night she didn't tell a story. Instead, she asked him, do you want silence tonight? Reed sat by the door, hands wrapped around a tin cup. After a long pause, he said, not if you have one worth telling. Clara smiled. That was the closest thing to a welcome she'd ever heard from him. She told one about a man who carved maps into trees because he forgot the paths after sundown. And at the end, when the man found himself back at his first carving, not realizing he'd walked in circles. Reed whispered, I know that trail. Clara didn't speak. She let the leather-bound thing sit unopened, like a closed mouth holding in breath, and let the fire talk for a while. The next morning she caught him humming, not loud, not tuneful, but a low rhythm, like a heartbeat with dust in it. She didn't interrupt, but she wrote it down. He hums like he's trying to remember a song from a dream. By the 10th night, the stories had become a ritual. She didn't need to ask. He didn't need to invite. They just sat and shared a space that was still broken, but now less empty. One night she told him, "You don't need to tell me yours." He looked over surprised. "I mean it," she added. "I'm not here to fix anything." Reed's voice was low. "Then why are you here?" Clara looked at him a long time before answering. "Because someone needs to hear what happens after your story ends." He turned away, slowly, and whispered, "I don't remember the beginning." Clara stood, walked over, sat on the floor beside him, and said, "Then I'll just keep talking until something sounds familiar." Some mornings Clara woke before the fire did. She would sit by the hearth in the gray light, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and pine, listening to the breath of the cabins shift as the forest woke up. That was when she felt him most. Not Reed the man, but Reed the absence. She still didn't know who he had been, but she was starting to know who he was in the way his boots always pointed toward the door even when he was seated, in how he touched wood like it might tell him something, and how his hands moved faster when she sang under her breath. She never meant to stay this long, but the days bled into each other, quietly without edges, and soon her notebook was full of pages that weren't meant for trade. They were for him, for the way he tilted his head when she mentioned rivers, for how he reached for things with his left hand first, as though the right had forgotten it was once dominant, for how when she laughed suddenly, his silence wasn't cold, it was choosing, but his breath caught like it remembered joy. One afternoon he fell. It wasn't dramatic, a misstep on a wet patch of stone near the woodpile, but the sound of him hitting the ground, bone and breath and bark, shook something loose in her. She was at his side before he could rise. He hissed when she touched his ankle, but didn't push her away. "Twisted," she muttered, fingers gently testing the swelling. "You'll need to stay off it." He grunted. Clara helped him inside, one arm around his waist. He leaned heavily on her, and for the first time, she felt the weight he carried in more than just silence. She sat him on the edge of the cot and knelt. His gaze followed her like he was afraid she'd vanish if he blinked. But when she finished and looked up, his eyes weren't cold. They were tired and open. That night she didn't tell a story. She just sat beside him, reading from a book she'd found in the corner of the cabin, a tattered thing with half its pages missing. He listened, eyes closed, and when she paused to turn the page, his hand brushed her knee. Accidental, maybe, but it stayed longer than it had to. Days passed with slow rhythm. Reed couldn't move well, so she chopped the wood, fetched water, swept the porch. He watched her without comment, but with a furrowed brow, as if watching her work bruised something in him. "You don't owe me anything," she said once, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I remember hands like yours," he said. She paused. "Mine?" He shook his head. "The way they move." Clara didn't answer, but that night she wrote, "His memory isn't broken, it's just sleeping. But the way he held a cup, like it could break or bloom, told her enough." One morning a writer came, young, dusty, out of breath. He brought a note. A town to the south had requested Clara's return. Someone wanted her stories. A wedding, a gathering, a room full of people who didn't yet know how their own tales might end. She tucked the note into her notebook and didn't speak of it for 2 days. On the third morning, Reed found her packing. Not everything, just enough. His jaw tightened. "You're leaving." "I said I'd be there," she answered. "Just for a few nights." He didn't reply, didn't ask how long, didn't ask if she'd return. But when she turned toward the door, he handed her a small bundle, 3 pine cones wrapped in twine. "For the road?" she asked, half smiling. He didn't meet her eyes. "To remember the quiet," he said. Clara didn't cry when she left, didn't look back, but she felt the weight of every unsaid word settle across her spine like snow. The town was louder than she remembered. Too many mouths, too many smiles that didn't reach eyes. She told stories for coin, for claps, for rooms full of people who listened but didn't hear. She missed the way Reed didn't interrupt, missed how he didn't applaud, just breathed deeper when something reached him. On the third night after the final tale, someone asked her, "Where do you find these stories?" Clara stared at her boots for a long moment, then said, "Sometimes they find you." She left before dawn, rode north with wind in her hair and frost on her gloves. And when she saw the cabin again, smoke curling from the chimney, door ajar like it had been waiting, she exhaled for the first time in days. Reed was outside, splitting wood with one crutch under his arm. When he saw her, he didn't smile, didn't nod, just said, "You came back." Clara swung down from the saddle, tied ribbon to the post, walked up the steps. "Of course I did." That night she told him a new story, one about a woman who found a man in the forest, broken not in bone but in memory, who didn't ask for her help, but accepted it like fire accepts air. And how, when she left to find herself, she realized she'd already been found. Reed didn't speak, but he reached out, took her hand, and traced the curve of her knuckle with his thumb. And when she looked up, she asked, "Do you remember me?" He shook his head slowly. "But my hands do." The town of Braxton Hollow sat in a bend of the river like it hadn't yet made up its mind whether to stay. It was the kind of place that only asked questions when they were about the weather or the next supply wagon, not people, and certainly not stories. Clara arrived at dusk, dusty, quiet, and half thinking about the man she'd left standing in a clearing 3 days north. She hadn't written since she left, not because she had nothing to say, but because she wasn't sure who would listen anymore. The innkeeper greeted her like a cousin lost to marriage. "You're early," he said, eyes squinting. "The wedding's not till Sunday." Clara gave a polite smile. "I'm not here for the wedding." "No? Then why'd the preacher send word?" She didn't answer right away, just took the room key, tipped her hat low, and climbed the stairs like the walls might collapse under more questions. Her room smelled of soap and stale books. She placed her satchel on the small desk by the window. The same notebook she'd carried into the forest lay inside, unopened. The pages at the back still curled from fire warmth. The faint smell of pine smoke lingered in the leather binding. She didn't open it. Not yet. That night, her voice curled around the fire like a blanket, wrapping them both in something older than memory. The room was full of oil lamps, tired parents, and wide-eyed children who leaned in with each breath she drew. They laughed where they should, gasped when she let silence linger just long enough. Clapped like applause could undo something broken. And still, she felt hollow. The room was full, but not listening. Not like he did, not like Reed. Back at the inn, she lay awake long after the candle burned low. She watched the shadows stretch across the ceiling, tried to remember the sound of his footsteps, the exact cadence of his voice when he'd said, "You came back." The second day was brighter. The baker brought fresh bread. A child drew her a picture of a fox with antlers. The preacher asked if she'd perform at the wedding. Clara smiled through all of it, but her notebook stayed closed. Her hands itched for work, her chest for weight, like both had forgotten how to feel full. That night, she finally opened the notebook, not to write, just to look. Between the pages, pressed between a leaf and a torn corner of a receipt, were the 3 pine cones Reed had given her. She hadn't realized she'd kept them. She touched one and whispered, "I'm not done, am I?" The pine cone didn't answer, but her fingers remembered his hands, and that was enough. On the 3rd morning, she woke before the bells, packed without sound, paid the innkeeper, refused the preacher's coins, and rode out before the town had time to ask why. The trail north was colder. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was the distance she'd put between herself and the only man who'd never asked for her story, only offered her a place inside his silence. By sundown, the trees returned. So did the hush, the kind that settled around your ribs and reminded you what breathing used to feel like. She passed the bend in the ridge, saw smoke rising, but it wasn't from the chimney, it was from the porch. Something burned. She kicked ribbon forward, faster, heart thudding. Not panic, not yet, just urgency, raw and full of thorns. The cabin came into view. The front steps were scorched, the table overturned. Ash scattered across the clearing like someone had tried to forget too quickly. But the door was open. She dismounted and ran. No thought, just legs, just breathe, just the sound of her name. Clara, his voice, from inside. She stumbled through the doorway, and there he was, standing, smoke smudged, eyes sharp. He had a cut above his brow and ash on his arms. But he was whole. He was him. "What happened?" she asked, chest tight. Reed looked at her a long moment. Then, "Fire caught on a coat. Old oil. Fool mistake. Why didn't you put it out?" "I tried." She moved toward him, touched his hand. It trembled. "I thought I'd lost you." Her words barely rose above breath, but they landed like a vow. He blinked. "I thought I'd lost me," he said. They sat together on the floor that night. No fire, just stars through the window and the faint crackle of memory. She held his hand. He didn't let go. "I went to finish my story," she said. "And it wasn't mine to finish." He turned his head, looked at her like a man seeing sunlight for the first time after years of shade. "You think this is a story?" he asked. She nodded. "It's all I know how to hold." He squeezed her fingers, then said, "Then hold me." The snow had started falling again, not the heavy, blinding kind, just enough to dust the trees, settle on the window panes, remind the world that winter hadn't quite finished speaking yet. Inside the cabin, silence hung like an extra layer of warmth. Familiar now. Not lonely. Clara sat near the hearth, mending a tear in her coat. Her needle moved slow even, the rhythm almost musical. Every few minutes she'd glance up, toward the table, where Reed sat hunched over a piece of bark, carving lines into it like they meant something. Maybe they did. He hadn't said much in the days since the fire. But the way he moved now, deliberate, present, told her something had shifted. Like memory wasn't just a thing that returned with words but with weight, with shape. The wound on his brow had scabbed over, and the cuts on his hands were healing, though his knuckles still cracked when he split wood. Clara noticed. She noticed everything now. How he stirred the soup the same direction every time. How he always watched her hands when she cooked, but never commented. How he listened to her stories like they were hymns, unfamiliar but sacred. And how sometimes he'd pause in the middle of whittling and press his thumb to his lips, like a word wanted out, but didn't know how. That morning he had handed her something, a wooden disc, round and smooth, with a shallow engraving in the center. It was a spiral, nothing more. But when she ran her thumb across it, she felt it, the movement, the pull inward. "It's the way I remember thing," he'd said, "not straight." She kept it in her pocket after that. Touching it made her feel closer to whatever part of him was still on its way back. On the 7th day after her return, she found him standing in the doorway, staring at the sky like it owed him an answer. He didn't move when she stepped beside him, didn't look away, but after a long moment he said, "My mother had hair like yours." Clara stilled. "Yeah?" He nodded. "Braided, thick. I used to hide things in it when I was little. Pine needles, pebbles." She smiled. "Did she notice?" "She always noticed, but she never said anything." Clara tucked her hair behind her ear. "She sounds like someone who understood stories." "She was a quilt maker," he said. There was silence. Then Reed added, voice lower, "She died in a fire." Clara closed her eyes. The wind picked up, fluttering ash still clinging to the porch rail. "I'm sorry," Reed shrugged. "I remember her face, her hands, but not the sound of her voice." "That's all right," Clara said gently. "Some people don't need sound to be remembered." That night he asked her to tell him something true. "Not a story," he said. "Just something real." Clara thought for a while, then said, "When I was 16, I made a map out of stars." He looked at her puzzled. "I lived near a river bend," she explained. "Our cabin sat in a crook of land that made it easy to get lost in fog. I stayed up for a week, drawing stars on paper and marking where the trees bent. And it worked. It got me home." Reed stared at the fire. "Do you still have it?" Clara shook her head. "I memorized it. The paper's gone." Reed didn't speak, but he picked up a stick and began sketching stars into the dirt beside the hearth. One by one, in silence, until the shape curved back on itself, just like her spiral. The next day, she found him standing by the stump behind the cabin, holding an old shirt in one hand and a bundle of feathers in the other. I think I used to make arrow, he said. You did, she replied. He turned to her. How do you know? She took the bundle from his hand. Because your hands know what your mind forgot. He watched her closely. Then quietly, so do yours. They didn't kiss that day, didn't touch more than a shared glance. But when they walked back to the cabin, they did it side by side, and neither looked down. That evening, Clara sat by the window with her notebook open in her lap, not writing. Reed was on the floor, legs stretched out, whittling again. This time it wasn't a shape, just motion. Over and over, the same path, like he was trying to carve a groove deep enough to remember something. I had a dog, he said suddenly. Clara looked up. Yeah? Big, brown, one ear flopped down. Do you remember his name? Reed frowned. No. Do you remember how it felt when he slept beside you? He nodded slowly. That's the name, she said. Reed blinked, then smiled. A little. Words aren't always the thing that matters, are they? No, Clara replied. Just the feeling behind them. The snow deepened. The wind came louder, and inside the warmth grew between them like a second fire. That night, Clara told him no story. Instead, she stood behind his chair and ran her fingers across his shoulders, gently, the way you do when someone is almost awake. You don't have to remember it all, just the parts that feel like home. He reached up, caught her hand in his, held it, and whispered, Clara. Her breath hitched. Say it again, she said. He turned to face her, took her other hand, and said with full memory, with full voice, Clara. She knelt before him, tears in her eyes, and he cupped her cheek like he'd done it 1,000 times, though neither of them remembered if he had. But it didn't matter, because in that moment, the forgetting didn't define him. She did. Later she wrote, he said my name like a door swinging open in a house I didn't know I'd built. And I stepped through. The snow melted slow that year. By the time the first buds pushed up through the forest floor, Clara had stopped counting the days. She no longer marked time by sunrises or chapters, or the number of stories she'd traded for meals. Now there was only before Reed and after. And in this after, there were no performances, no clapping strangers. Only a man who once forgot his name, and a woman who remembered enough for both of them. They moved like people who had known each other forever, even if they still stepped carefully sometimes. Reed still didn't speak often, but when he did, the words felt earned. Small coins dropped into a well that had run dry too long. He asked questions now, about her stories, about her brother, about what her voice sounded like when she wasn't telling tales for a crowd. Clara never rushed to answer. Sometimes she'd respond with another story. Sometimes she'd just look at him until the question no longer needed words. And once, just once, she asked, do you think we've always known each other? Somewhere before, Reed had only said, not always, but long enough. Spring brought travelers, one or two at first, lost or wayward, then a family looking for fresh land to settle, then a tinker, a trapper, a preacher with a limp and a sermon he swore could drive out snow. They came asking for warmth, water, directions, but they stayed for stories. It started small, a boy on the porch shivering, and Clara offering a tale about fireflies who built a summer from nothing but moonlight and wishbones. Then the boy told it to his sister. Then their mother asked to hear it again, and Reed stood nearby the whole time, splitting wood in measured rhythm. Eyes trained on the grain, but ears tuned to every word. One night, after the last guest left and the coals dimmed, Clara turned to Reed. Do you think we could go? He looked up. Go where? Everywhere. He raised a brow. There are places that don't have stories yet, she said. Or maybe they do, but they're not finished. I want to find them. Reed was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You'd leave this? Clara nodded. Not because I don't love it, but because I think you'd love what's beyond it. He looked at her, really looked, and asked softly, Would I? She let the warmth rise, slow and quiet. I think you already do. It took them 3 weeks to prepare. They packed light, 1 mule, 2 bags, his carving tools, her notebook, a blanket that still smelled of pine and smoke, and a small pouch filled with stories folded into slips of paper, tiny, worn, and ink-blotted. Clara had written them all, and Reed carried everyone like they were pieces of her breath. They left the cabin before sunrise. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't need to. They rode until the trees thinned, until the air smelled of rivers and dust instead of wood smoke and memory. And when they made camp that night under stars that blinked like old friends, Clara lit a small fire. Reed sat beside her, hands still. She passed him the notebook. He didn't open it, just rested it on his knee, and said, "You start." So she did. Her voice wove through the dark, low and steady. She told of a woman who once lived inside other people's stories until she met a man who didn't want to hear them. He wanted to live one. Reed didn't speak, but he reached out, covered her hand with his, and when she fell silent, he whispered, "Tell me the next part." They traveled slow, through pine valleys and red dirt plains, sometimes on foot, sometimes by mule, sometimes by memory. They stayed where people needed warmth or quiet or something not quite named. She told stories. He carved tokens, small wooden leaves, stars, feathers, and left them on doorsteps. No charge, no names. Only proof that someone had passed through and listened. Once a child asked, "Are you two married?" Clara smiled. "No." "Why not?" Reed answered. "Because some people are bound by names, and others by stories." By summer, they had walked through 3 towns, crossed 2 rivers, and shared more words than Clara could ever write down. One night, camped beside a dry creek bed, Clara found herself quiet. Reed noticed. "You haven't told a story in 2 nights," he said. She shrugged. "I don't think I need to anymore." He frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because I'm not collecting endings anymore," she whispered. "I'm living one." Reed took her face in his hands then. He kissed her once, slow, careful, like he was afraid to break the silence that had held them for so long. And when they parted, he rested his forehead to hers. "Then tell me," he said, "how does it end?" Clara smiled and said, "It doesn't." They didn't ride off into the sunset. They rode into something quieter, the kind of ending that doesn't echo, only lingers. He didn't recover every memory. She didn't tell every story, but together, they became the kind of tale people whisper about long after the fire's gone out. Not for the words they shared, but for the silence they survived. Because sometimes we don't need a perfect past, just someone willing to walk beside us into a future we don't have to narrate alone. What part of their story felt like a piece of yours? Let us know in the comments and tell us, where in the world are you watching from tonight? We read every single one,